I'm glad this evening to look out and see a congregation. I know that tonight we are running in the same time slot as Symphony, and many people who like a reflective evening like to go there. But you give us courage by being here this evening. In recent times, I have been doing quite a bit of thinking about what I have come to refer to as the bare essentials. In my own mind, the bare essentials are those things that are absolutely necessary for living as opposed to those which are discretionary. In doing this kind of thinking, I have found myself to be quite at odds with the way culture is today. In general, we tend to be maximalists. We really do believe in our land that bigger is better and that more is to be preferred over less. A bigger salary is much more desirable than a smaller one. A bigger house is more to be desired than a smaller one. In fact, I was noticing not too long ago some of the statistics about homes. I believe, if my memory serves me correctly, that back in the 1960s, the average size of a new house was about 1,200 square feet. Today, it is more than double that. It's no wonder that our prices go up, at least partially for that reason. And when it comes to automobiles, at least until we had a dose of $3 a gallon gasoline, bigger and fancier was always better. And even when you come to church, it is commonly perceived that bigger is better. A larger congregation is more desirable than a smaller one. If you can speak of more bricks and more bucks and more baptisms, then you are a notch higher than those who speak of fewer. And it is not uncommon in our day even to hear links being made between maximalist thinking and God. You see, if you are faithful, we hear people say, then God will give you more. And if you are not wealthy, if you don't have a lot, perhaps you need to look at your faith. I saw a preacher not too long ago preaching his heart out, and he was unburdening himself of a great burden. He was telling the TV audience and his own congregation that God was about to unleash an anointing. And this anointing was going to follow his sermon. And he told the saints that they could get in on this anointing. And they could do it by making a gesture of faith. And then he went on to proclaim that the best gesture of faith would be to give a perfect offering, $777. All the fascination in our day with maximalist thinking has obscured the fact that more and bigger almost always make life more complicated and burdensome. You see, somehow we have forgotten that the more things a person has, the more likely they are to become prisoner to their own possessions. Years ago when I was in college, I knew of a man who had 5 homes. He was a wealthy man. He had one in the mountains of Vermont, he had one in Montreal, he had one in Florida, one in the Southwest, somewhere in the desert, and I don't know where the 5th one was. But a friend of mine was the caretaker at the one in Vermont. And I used to chuckle inwardly as I heard him talk about the great worries of the man who owned 5 homes. He would say to his family, we haven't been down to the one in the Southwest for 3 months. I wonder if it's okay. Maybe we ought to go down there. He had become prisoner to his own possessions. And we have forgotten with our bigger is better mentality that sometimes the only thing worse than not having something is getting it. I don't know how many of you have had that experience, where you longed and dreamed and fantasized about something, and then you got it, only to discover that it was more trouble than you had ever imagined. Maximalist thinking can easily get us all embroiled in a never-ending and always unrelenting race, driven by this kind of hidden notion, presumption that whoever has the most at the end wins. In that kind of race, it's very easy for us to get confused and to jumble that which is necessary with that which is discretionary. And in the face of all of this in our culture, I find it a very interesting exercise to involve myself in minimalist thinking, asking the question, what is the very least that we need? And I would invite you to some minimalist thinking tonight. Perhaps we could begin by thinking about food, and I hope all of you have had supper, so I'm not going to disturb you unduly when I talk about food. What I ask you is the least amount of food that is necessary. You know that national statistics on food show that we as Americans are eating more than our share. And I think of people like Viktor Frankl, the well-known Austrian psychiatrist who spent a number of years in one of the death camps of the Second World War, and he survived, along with many others, on a diet of very thin, watery soup that sometimes had a few peas in the bottom and occasionally a potato skin. And I know of people who have eaten grass and leaves and survived for sometimes 4, 5, 6 months. Now, I'm not advocating that diet, you understand. I'm raising the question, what is the least that we need? How long could you last on a 25-pound bag of rice and 25 pounds of beans? If you think about that, we look at that as a rather spare diet, but it could sustain life quite a while. You might also think how much time and money you would save if you became a culinary minimalist. Now, I'm not advocating that either. Like the rest of you, I like to eat good food. Or perhaps we could think about money tonight. What is the least amount of money that you actually need in order to live? I had a lesson in this a few years ago when I was in the country of Zambia with a group of students, and we were traveling from the capital city, Lusaka, down to the Victoria Falls, and we happened to give a young man from the Sudan, Leonard was his name, we gave him a ride in the bus with us. He was an Adventist gentleman who had never been down that way, and he had some acquaintances, and so we offered him a ride gratis. And as we rode along, somehow it came to my attention that Leonard had no money at all. Zero, no cash. So I began to ask him, I said, Leonard, for how long can you live with absolutely no cash of any kind? And he said, 15 months, 18 months, no problem at all. And I said, now you understand my question. I say, how long can you live with no money of any kind? He said, 18 months. And he explained to me how where he lived, if he needed food, he grew it himself. If he needed housing, he went into the forest and cut what he needed. When he wanted a place to build his house, he went to the chief and applied for permission to build his house in a certain place. The only thing he needed money for occasionally was to buy some clothing. Now, I don't think any of us could last 18 months without the expenditure of any cash. But I wonder how little we could get by on. Those of you who perhaps endured the depression probably could give us a few lessons. Or think for a moment about clothing. What is the least amount of clothing you would need? And understand, I have no prurient interest here. I'm not interested in how little you cover yourself with, but how many articles you have in the closet. We tend to have a vast array, to be honest with you. But I wondered, for how long could you and I remain decent if we had only one set of clothes? Just one. Now, you'd have to wash it at night, I suppose. Or what about housing? There's a fascinating thought. What is the bare minimum requirements that you would need in order to survive in terms of housing? And this one I like to play with sometimes because I don't mind roughing it. I'm not one who would like to sleep on the ground necessarily because of all the varmints and the bugs that dwell there, but just above the ground is fine. How long could you survive for in a tent? Or in a little shack that you built yourself in the woods? Do you know that there are people in the world who last for decades, even whole lives, with virtually nothing compared to what we have? We could go on looking at other things, but I think I have made the point tonight that minimalist thinking is in its own way fascinating. It has significant value because it cuts through the discretionary things of life and causes us to contemplate the very basics. I ask you to wonder with me tonight what happens to religion if we try that same experiment on the subject of religion. You know, religion looked at in a global fashion is a vastly complex thing. So many religions, so many claims, so many theories, so many requirements, so many books. And even if you were to single out Christianity as preferable, if you were to have it stand on its own, the problem does not really go away, because how many branches of the Christian faith do you know about? And how many opinions, how many theories, how many injunctions, how many stipulations, how many requirements, how many do's and don'ts? In the face of all of this, it's not really surprising that many people today, when they look at religion, they give up. And they say, how can anybody know, so what's the point? But let me ask you this morning to contemplate together what happens when we bring the minimalist question up against the Christian faith, when we ask what its bare essentials are. What is the least that is necessary in order for a person to say that they have found peace or made peace with God? What is the very least that must happen in order for somebody to say that they are now saved? To be truthful with you, I've spent quite a few happy hours thinking about this, contemplating it, rolling it around in my head, playing with different ideas. And I formulated an answer that I want to share with you that I think is viable. It seems to me that in the equation of salvation there are two bare essentials. Two. The first is this: that a person must come to the realization that there is something inherently wrong with life here that they cannot remedy by themselves. And that if not remedied, that brokenness is going to destroy them. Most of us here do not have to live very long before we realize that everything in this life is in fact broken. Nothing here is completely whole. Health is not whole. If you have been sick, you understand that. Relationships are not whole. If a relationship has ever broken around you, you understand. Ideas are not whole. They are always somehow obtuse and convoluted, and there's something wrong with them. Transactions are not perfect. Agreements break down. Understandings are incomplete. Expectations seem so often to be disappointed. And life itself, we learn, is broken. Life itself, because we begin young and pliable and fresh and lithe, and we grow to the point of being old and decrepit. And then we die. And through all of this, there seems to be a sense about our living that there is something here that is not the way it should be. Have you ever lost a loved one? Do you know what it is to go home and find only an empty place where once a warm human being used to be? Do you know what it is like to live with that empty place with the understanding that nothing will ever fill it? Then you know what it means to have a very real sense that this is not how things in life should be. And it usually doesn't take us very long to figure this out. The death of a pet can do that to a child. The loss of a friend, a fight at school, who knows? But the sense comes that there is something inherently wrong with our living here. And if you look at that sense of wrongness, you will find that almost always it has a personal aspect to it at some point. We sense that we ourselves are caught up in this brokenness, and this brokenness is going to destroy us. Unless it is fixed, there is no peace and there is no joy. We live with the absence of resolution.